Math 76, lesson 49, the decimal number line in tenths, and dividing by fraction. So let's talk about the decimal number line. So if you remember when we talked about the number line, we said we could fit every single number on the number line. And here they're talking about decimals. So the way the decimal number line works is it's very similar to your ruler. They just take a number line, and let's focus in on this because this is really close. There we go. They take a decimal number line, and the distance between 0 and 1 has some tick marks cut into it. If we count these, we've got 1 space, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 spaces, which gives us room for 10 decimal numbers. So if we were to ask what number is at this space right here in between 0 and 1, we would say that is 1/10 or 0.1. Here we would say that's 2/10 or 0.2. And now they use this decimal number line. They ask, well, what number is right here? Well, to figure out this number here, we would start at the 1. We'd say, okay, well, it's going to be 1 point something, and then we count. Then we count 1, 2, 3. So that means this number is going to be 1.3 or 1 3/10. Okay. And that's pretty much it for using the decimal number line. And this is what your problems are going to look like in your book. They're going to ask you what decimal number is represented by a point on this number line. They'll give you a decimal number line. And what you have to do is identify what whole number you have, if you have one, and then what decimal that is. So if we look at this point y, we know it's to the right of 7, so it's going to be 7 point something. And then to figure out what decimal point it is, we count 1, 2, 3, 4. So the answer here is going to be 7 4/10 or 7.4. And that's the solution that they came up with right here. So that should be a pretty simple problem to handle. Next, what we're going to be talking about is dividing by fractions. And we actually use word problems to explain this. So I'm going to start with this one. This question right here. They ask, how many quarters are there in $3? Right? So some of you may be thinking, how is this a fractional division problem? Well, let me show you. So we have the question, how many quarters, I should have just put a capital Q, how many quarters are in $3? All right, well, the key here is representing quarters as a fraction. So if you remember, a quarter is 1/4 of a dollar, right? Hence the name quarter. So if we know that a quarter is 1/4 of a dollar, so 1/4 of $1, then the question is, if I can figure out how many quarters are in a dollar, then I can figure out how many are in $3, right? So to find out how many groups are in a whole, we would use division, right? So then the division problem would be 1 divided by 1/4, right? Now the problem is we've never done a problem like this before, and if we do try to set it up the same way we do our multiplication, we run into a problem. We have 1/1 because we write it as a fraction, and then if we were to divide the top by 1 and divide the bottom by 4, 1 divided by 1 is 1, and then 1 divided by 4 is 1/4, or a decimal number that we haven't learned how to solve yet. So we end up 1/1/4, which again is a fraction that should be written as a division problem, which equals 1 divided by 1/4. So that kind of puts us right back where we started. So we need to learn how to divide fractions so we don't get caught in this endless loop. Now there are ways out of this endless loop using this method, but it's very, very time consuming. So I'm not going to take the time to show you now. And it also involves some math that you haven't learned yet. So how can we figure out the answer to this problem without having to go through this entire loop? Well, if you remember the concept of the reciprocal is one number times another number equals the number 1, right? And then we learned that if we had a number like 1/4, 1/4 would be multiplied by its reciprocal to equal 1, and the reciprocal would just be this fraction, but flipped upside down, right? So 1/4 times 4/1 would equal 1. So using this logic, we could also reverse the multiplication problem and say, using a multiplication fact, that if 1/4 times 4/1 equals 1, well then 1 divided by 1/4 would equal 4/1. And vice versa, 1 divided by 4/1 would equal 1/4, which leads us to this problem right here, the original one that we had. So that's why we use this unit of $1. So if we're going to do division of fractions, the method they're teaching right now is find 1 unit. How many of those fractions are in 1 unit? So how many quarters are in $1 is quite simply going to be the reciprocal of 1/4. So we will invert 1/4, and it will become 4/1, which we could also say is the whole number 1. So we found our reciprocal, and that's going to be step 1. Step 1, to divide by fractions, find the reciprocal. Now that we've found the reciprocal, or the answer to how many quarters in $1, being 4 quarters in $1, now we have to figure out how many quarters are in $3. So if there's 4 quarters in $1, all I have to do is I take this reciprocal and I multiply that reciprocal by the amount that I'm looking for. So 4 times 3 would give me 12. So the answer is going to be 12 quarters. So step 2 is going to be multiply. Oh, I can't spell multiply. Multiply. Forgive my spelling. We'll just, yeah. So, in order to divide by a fraction, you have to find the reciprocal of your fraction and then multiply. So, let's put this into practice in a word problem, because that's how you're going to see them. This example problem says, write and solve a fraction division problem for this question. Pads of writing paper were stacked 12 inches high on a shelf. The thickness of each pad was 3/8 of an inch. How many pads were in a 12-inch stack? So, before I figure out how many pads are in a 12-inch stack, I want to figure out how many 3/8 inch pads are in 1-inch stack. So let's do that. So we've got a 3/8 inch pad of paper, and how many in 12-inch stack? Right? That's the problem we're dealing with. So the first division problem we're going to put is going to be, well, how many are in a 1-inch stack? So I'm going to take 1 inch divided by 3/8. And if you remember, our answer is always going to be our reciprocal. If we have 1 divided by a fraction, the answer will always be the reciprocal. So the reciprocal is 3/8 upside down, or 8/3. So there are 8/3 of these pads in a 1-inch stack. Once I have the reciprocal, step 1, reciprocal. I take that reciprocal and I go to step 2, which is multiply. So I'm going to take 8/3 and I'm going to multiply it by 12. So I take 8/3 times 12, but I have to write that as a fraction, so I make it 12/1. 8 times 12, ooh, that's a tough one. That's 96. Wait, 94? Oh no, hold on. I'm having a brain freeze here. Let me think this through. 8 times 10 is 80. 8 times 2 is 16. 80 plus 16, 96. Very good. Okay, so I was right the first time. Sometimes I have those moments of doubt. All right, and then 3 times 1 is 3. So now my answer is 96/3. Can I reduce this? Well, if I use my divisibility rules, I can take 9 plus 6. That gives me 15. 15 is divisible by 3. So I can divide both of these numbers by 3. Let's figure out what this is reduced. So let's take 96 divided by 3. 3 goes into 9 3 times. 3 times 3 is 9. Subtract 0, bring down the 6. 3 goes into 6 2 times. 2 times 3 is 6. And it zeroes out. So my answer is 32. And then 3 divided by, where was I? 96 over 3. So if I take 96 and I divide it by 3, I get 32. And then if I take the denominator of 3 and I divide it by 3, I get 1, which means my final answer is 32 stacks, or 32 pads. All right. So remember, when you're dividing fractions, when you're dividing by fractions, you take the fraction you're dividing by, you find the reciprocal, and then you multiply that by the number you're supposed to divide. We'll probably clean this up a little bit later as we focus more on the algorithm in later lessons, but this lesson is just solely focused on teaching the concept. They want you to understand why we're using the reciprocal, because that's one of the number one things that people tend to forget when they're dividing by fractions. So that's it for this lesson. If you have any questions, let me know on the school website, and I will see you in class.